We are talking today with Greg Pahl. Greg Pahl is a full-time freelance writer and journalist who has followed energy issues for over 25 years. He is the author of several books that include The Complete Idiot's Guide to Saving the Environment, Natural Home Heating, The Complete Guide to Renewable Energy Options, Biodiesel, Growing a New Energy Economy, and he is here to talk about his latest book, The Citizen-Powered Energy Handbook, Community Solutions to a Global Crisis. Tell us, what was the motivation in writing your latest book, The Citizen-Powered Energy Handbook, Community Solutions to a Global Crisis?
I think that the primary motivation was that the challenges that we face regarding energy as we move forward here are so enormous. The need to make a shift between our current total dependence on fossil fuels to shift from there to a greater dependence on a broad range of renewable energy strategies. That challenge is so enormous that we need to do more than just changing out light bulbs and insulating our homes. While that's very important, and I certainly encourage everyone to take those individual steps, we need to start thinking even beyond that in order to make this shift as quickly as possible. And so the idea of thinking in terms of larger groups of people, and especially community, to make some of these renewable energy strategies work on a larger scale. And so the book's primary focus is on collaborative ventures of one kind or another, community-based, in order to help push that process along.
So can you give us a brief overview of the different solutions that are currently available to us?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a broad range of them, and they're covered pretty fully in the book, but and it tends to follow each individual renewable strategy. So solar power makes a lot of sense in most cases. There are a lot of different ways that you can retrofit existing buildings with various active solar systems. Domestic hot water, for instance. I have some of those on my own home back in Vermont, and we get virtually all of our hot water in the summer and some in the winter. You can use photovoltaics to create electricity, generate electricity, install photovoltaic panels on the roof of your home or on the roof of your business, whatever. There are a wide range of other strategies, again, depending on your particular location and the particular renewable resource that's available in your area. And that's a key point. It doesn't make any sense to spend a lot of time in energy planning some sort of collaborative or cooperative community wind project, say, if you don't have a good wind resource. And conversely, if you do have a good potential hydroelectric site, then it certainly would make sense to pursue that. So the first thing that any group of people would want to do, whether it's on the individual or community level, is to look at the natural renewable resources that you have available in your particular area and then focus on the ones that seem to be the most promising. Then, of course, there would be the whole sector of biofuels, which I cover, biomass and biofuels, which is covered pretty thoroughly in the book. There are local community-based biofuels projects. They can be biodiesel, they could be ethanol. There are solid biomass projects like wood chips, wood pellets. There's quite a bit of interest and current experiments going on regarding grass pellets as a solid fuel. There's quite a bit of that going on in Vermont right now. So there are many, many different options, and I guess I forgot geothermal is another possibility, both high and low temperature geothermal. People get confused about that. But high temperature geothermal is what's available on the West Coast here related to volcanism. And so there are a number of cities on the West Coast, particularly in California. Klamath Falls, I think, is one of them that has a city-wide district heating system that taps into that high-temperature geothermal. And it's a citywide project, so it's a city-owned project. Low-temperature geothermal is what's usually referred to in conjunction with ground source heat pumps, and you simply drill a special type of deep well to tap into the groundwater, and you can extract latent heat from that water, even though it seems to be relatively cold. And it runs through a heat pump, and you can heat, and then you can also cool your house or business in the summer with a ground source heat pump by reversing the process, and you take the heat out of the building and dissipate it into the ground. So there's many, many different strategies that you could use.
So then do you recommend communities to get together and first do an inventory of what the available energy sources would be?
Yes, absolutely. And an energy audit of your current energy situation, whether it's an individual homeowner or a community, it's still a worthwhile exercise, allows you to see where you are currently. And there have been a number of communities around the country who are involved in this so-called relocalization movement, which is to strengthen and revitalize the local economy, to allow local communities to provide more of their basic necessities of life from their local environment. Now, a lot of these communities have done energy audits. Willits, California, which is a small community in Northern California, is probably the furthest along on this. They started this a number of years ago, and they did a complete energy audit of their entire community. And when they got done with that energy audit, they realized they were totally vulnerable in terms of future price increases in energy, particularly petroleum-based fuels, which is where we are the most vulnerable, particularly in transportation. And so they took that energy audit, and then they tried to figure out how they could move forward to shift to more renewables, make that shift from our current overdependence on fossil fuels, and particularly petroleum-based fuels, to a broad range of renewables. And they realized there was no way that they could do it without serious conservation and serious cuts in their current energy use. And so they've been developing a range of very creative strategies to try to start making that shift now to a more locally based energy economy. And they went beyond energy too. These issues are all interrelated to other aspects of life, and especially to food, because our current agribusiness food system in this country in particular is so totally dependent on still relatively inexpensive fossil fuels, and particularly petroleum fuels. You need, I think the figure is, there are 10 units of fossil fueled energy, particularly petroleum energy, that goes into every 1 unit of food that the average American eats. So we're eating fossil fuels in one respect. And if fossil fuels and petroleum becomes excessively expensive in the future, and I can assure you that it will, the only question is when, not if, it's going to raise the price of food around the world and in this country dramatically. And so all of these, the energy issues and the food issues are definitely interconnected.
So as individuals, if we're tackling this, and let's take Seattle as an example, the city is doing some of this stuff on its own. If I'm looking at wanting to set up a system and survive, make things good for my kids, then obviously some of these solutions I can do as an individual. Like, let's say solar, I can integrate that into my house. But some of these solutions that are in the book, like biogas, doesn't seem like something that I'd be like building for my own home. It seems more like a community-wide effort.
Yes, that's a really good point. Some of these strategies are more appropriate for slightly larger scale projects, and there are examples of biomass projects in particular that are being used on a larger scale. The city of Minneapolis, for example, has what's known as a combined heat and power system, CHP, where they burn several hundred 100,000 tons of waste wood every year to both heat and cool most of the downtown in the city, which is pretty remarkable. And because it's combined heat and power, they also feed about 25 megawatts of electricity into the Minnesota electric grid at the same time. So it's a very efficient system. It's been very successful, but it's too big to do, as an individual homeowner type project. That's a really good example where a community project really takes advantage of the advantages of scale, economies of scale. But I think in order to help people get their minds around the concept of community-supported energy, a definition might be helpful. And I think that the best way to explain it is that community-supported energy projects are similar to what is known as community-supported agriculture. CSE, CSA are the initials that they're usually referred to by. The main difference, however, is that instead of investing in food, which you would do with a community-supported agriculture project, with community-supported energy, local residents invest in energy projects that provide greater energy security, a cleaner environment, and a wide variety of other benefits. Community-supported energy can be applied to virtually any type of local renewable energy projects, such as wind or solar or thermal or photovoltaic systems, biogas digesters, or a variety of biofuels production facilities, and I think also geothermal or geoelectric projects. And small-scale hydro also falls into that category. Community-supported energy projects have a number of advantages. They create new jobs and business opportunities right in your own community, which is a real plus. They generally tend to expand the tax base. They can also generate new income in the local economy. They get people involved, and that's really an important aspect, because with a lot of energy projects today, particularly like large-scale wind farms in some parts of the country, people feel like these projects are being imposed upon them from the outside and that there's no real local benefit. But if you have a community-based project that is conceived of, designed, sited, and also allows for investment from within the local community for the benefit of the local community, then you get people involved in that right from the beginning, and it usually converts many of the not-in-my-backyard crew to a please-in-my-backyard crew. It totally changes the whole debate because it gets the community involved right from the beginning. And then finally, probably the most important benefit of all is that these locally owned projects retain more money in the local economy than a project that's owned by an out-of-state corporate entity, which tends to siphon off most of the profits to somewhere else. And there have been some recent studies by a number of different groups that tend to indicate that these locally owned projects can retain perhaps 3 or 4 times more money in the local economy than a project that's owned by an out-of-state developer. So it's a huge engine for local economic development, as well as helping to clean up the environment and provide more energy security for you and your community as we move forward.
One of the criticisms of some of the renewables, and for instance, let's say photovoltaics, is that it takes more energy to produce the different components than what you really get out of them in the long run. Do you think that's true?
In general, I would say no. The amount of energy or embedded energy that you have in any sort of strategy is a really important factor. And for example, the amount of energy that you put into making ethanol out of corn, and this is a somewhat controversial topic, to say the least, but and depending on whose study you believe, there's a general consensus that it takes roughly for every 1 unit of energy that you put in to produce a unit of ethanol, you get back 1.34 units. So it's just slightly positive. And that's corn-based ethanol, which is the least efficient of the strategies, and in my personal opinion has no long-term potential because it simply isn't sustainable in the long run. Biodiesel, by comparison, again, depending on whose figures you believe, there's a general consensus that you get about 3 units of energy back out for every 1 unit of fossil energy that you put in. So it has what's referred to as a positive net energy balance. When it comes to various other renewable technologies, photovoltaics is one that you mentioned. There is a fairly high amount of energy involved in the production, the manufacture of those products, but the amount of energy that they are going to create over their lifetime is far more than any embedded energy that there might be. So I think the main point that people should take away from this is that, first of all, there are no perfect solutions here. This is an imperfect world, and all of us need to start looking at these options that we have, this broad range of renewable options, and adding up all of the advantages and then adding up all of the disadvantages, and there are always disadvantages to every strategy, and then comparing those two and trying to decide whether the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And if the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, then that's certainly a sensible strategy to pursue.
Can you share with us some of the more inspiring efforts or projects that you came across in working on your book?
Sure. I think the Danish wind industry in general is a really good example, and one of the first examples of community-owned energy projects. Denmark is generally regarded as the leader in the world wind sector. But what most people don't realize is that most of the early Danish turbines were smaller or mid-sized turbines that were owned by local community members, farmers, and other community groups in small clusters. And they were owned through wind cooperatives in one form or another. So they were literally community-owned, and there are thousands of these all over the place in Denmark. That idea has been borrowed by other European countries as well, and Sweden and in England, and especially in Germany, where there are huge wind farms all over Germany. I've seen many of them up close personally, and they're really remarkable. And after a while, you get used to them. They just kind of blend into the countryside, and you see those huge turbine blades just spinning slowly in the wind, and it's almost like a kinetic sculpture. So it's really, I don't mind them at all. In North America, this idea of community ownership has now been transferred to North America. It's beginning to catch on around the country. It's still in its early stages, admittedly. One of the best examples is a wind project in Toronto known as WindShare, which is a large commercial-scale wind turbine in downtown Toronto, right on the lakefront. And it's 50% owned by the WindShare Cooperative, which is composed of, I think it's 427 members, each of whom own a share in this turbine. The other half of the turbine is owned by Toronto Hydro, which is a local utility. And this joint ownership strategy between the co-op and the utility turned out to be very useful, because the utility, of course, was very familiar with all the rules and the regulations and the technical aspects of making connections and so on. And the co-op, of course, didn't have that experience, but they had the interest in the community ownership side, and so they combined their efforts, and has been an extremely successful project, so successful that they are now planning a second turbine. There's a smaller scale, slightly different type of project located in Hull, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And the community of Hull has a municipal utility of its own, And quite a few years ago, they had an early first-generation wind turbine, which they were experimenting with. And they liked the way it was performing. They've got a great location on the water. And so they installed a Hull, what's now known as Hull Wind 1, which is a commercial-scale turbine, owned by this little utility. And that was so successful that they've just this last year installed Hull Wind 2, which is much larger and much more efficient and producing a lot more electricity. And again, it's a community-owned project. Going to shift gears and talk just a little bit about biomass, because there's a great example of community-based biomass of a sort back in my home state of Vermont, where 33 schools around the state have gotten rid of their old, inefficient electric heating systems, and they've installed wood chip or wood pellet-based central heating systems, usually hot water boilers. And these systems have saved these schools in the last year that they checked the cost benefits, and they've saved well over $500,000 in utility costs by converting to these wood chip heating systems. And that's reducing taxes for local taxpayers who have to fund these schools. So I think another thing that's important to understand about this concept of community ownership is that the definition of just what exactly is a community energy project is very flexible, needs to be very flexible. It could be you could have a legal structure that was, say, a limited liability corporation that would be set up for a specific project, and that's a fairly common strategy. And that would usually be done by a group of local community members who wanted to do that particular project. You could also have a cooperative, like I mentioned with WindShare in Toronto. That's a cooperative. And most of the wind cooperatives in Denmark are cooperative structures. It could be a school district, and that's the example of the Vermont wood chip initiative is our school districts that are doing that. Could be a municipal utility like Hull down in Massachusetts. Or it could be another municipal entity of one kind or another, maybe a combination of these different things. So what is a community energy project? Well, as long as there's a number of community members who are involved in it, it's a community project, as long as it's owned by the local community. That's the key thing. Local ownership is the real key to this. And that's what transforms what would otherwise be just another corporate energy project into an engine for local economic development. And that's the key. And I think I'd like everybody to try to remember that the local ownership aspect is so important.
Do you believe these local community-based renewable projects can actually fully replace our current energy structure?
Probably not anytime soon, because, again, the enormity of this task that we have is so huge that it's going to literally take years. I think in the long run, it's certainly, anything that we can do at the local level to start making that transition now is very important. And so I certainly would encourage everyone to start thinking in these terms, both at the individual level and at the community level, of course, and ideally at the national level as well. Eventually we'll drag them along kicking and screaming, but right now let's do what we can do at the local level. There have been a number of studies, recent studies, about the whole peak oil situation and the amount of time that we need to make this transition from our current situation to the renewable strategies. And there've been a couple of reports. The Hirsch report was known as the Hirsch report, was published in 2005, and it basically said that if we started to make this transition 20 years ahead of the onset of peak oil, that we would be able to make this transition relatively painlessly. Then they looked at it from another scenario and said, well, if we started 10 years ahead, could we still do it? And the answer was a qualified yes, but it was going to involve quite a bit of economic, political, and social dislocation in order to make that transition. And then their third scenario was a 0-year head start. In other words, reacting instead of proactively making the shift ahead of time. And that 0-year scenario was rather discouraging, that the economic, political, social disruptions would be enormous. And so trying to figure out when the onset of peak oil is going to take place is so important, and it's also the one question that nobody really knows the answer to. Although there is an increasing consensus, at least among those in the peak oil community who've been studying this for years, that the onset is going to probably be a lot sooner than most people had imagined. U.S. Energy Information Agency for years has been maintaining that this wouldn't take place until sometime after 2037. I don't think anybody seriously believes those figures anymore. There is one geophysicist named Ken DeFeus who wrote a number of books on the subject recently, and in his 2005 book, he predicted that peak oil would take place in December, I think it was, of 2005. The thing about peak oil is that you really don't know that you've passed the peak until after the fact. And so it will take probably 3 or 4 or more years of global oil production statistics in order to look back and say, oh, yeah, it did happen whenever, several years ago. And there are some very disturbing statistics that have been coming out in very recently. The International Energy Agency always tracks global oil production statistics, and from January 2006 to January 2007, some of the most recent statistics shows that the production of conventional oils worldwide was essentially flatlined. It seems to have stopped going up, and there was an even more recent set of statistics buried in those statistics that were specific to Saudi Arabia. And of course, everybody's watching Saudi Arabia because they are the key major global resource, because of their huge reserves, or huge presumed reserves, let me say. And the production of Saudi Arabian oil between that same period declined 8.5%. Now that's huge news that you don't hear on the standard evening news. It's unclear at this point whether that's simply a temporary anomaly or whether that's the harbinger of things to come. The Saudis claim that they voluntarily reduced production, but if you compare the timelines between their claims and the timelines that track the actual production statistics, those two things don't match. And so we really don't know where we're at in terms of global oil reserves, because there is no transparency with those statistics in the global oil markets. Most of these OPEC countries treat their reserves and a lot of their other statistics as state secrets. And so trying to figure out exactly where we are in order to make some rational plans for the future is extremely difficult. And that's a situation that a lot of people are very, very concerned about.
We have just been talking with Greg Pahl. He is author of the new book, the Citizen-Powered Energy Handbook, Community Solutions to a Global Crisis.